So if there's something holding us back, one of those three things is missing. Either we don't know how to do it, sort of from a competency standpoint, we don't care enough to want to do it, or we're not clear on what that next step is.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm excited today to be joined by a good friend of mine. He is the founder at actionable.co, and he is an expert when it comes to, especially in the consulting space, how to not only enhance the impact that you have on your clients, especially as it relates to helping them learn new things and actually change their behaviors as an organization, but also, very importantly, proving that impact to them. So being able to actually circle back and say, hey, this is how the work we did actually impacted your organization and got you closer to the goals that you have. So I'm really excited to dive into our conversation today with that. Chris Taylor, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
This is my pleasure, Marcel. I've been looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Well, I've given everyone a little bit of context on you and your background, but I'd love to have you, in your own words, describe who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name's Chris. I'm in Canada. And we work with consultants and trainers and facilitators to help them sustain, improve the impact of the work they do with their clients. I found that particularly with those that are educating groups of participants, there's a magic that happens in the room, but only the people that are in the room feel that in the room. And then feedback forms afterwards don't necessarily, sort of capture that magic. And so I wanted to shine a light on the impact that's being created. And I've been running Actionable now for about 17 years. We work with now about 400 consulting firms around the globe and sitting on, I believe, one of the world's largest data sets when it comes to behavior change in a corporate environment. So there's my geeky claim to fame.
There you go. I did not know that stat about you, but that makes sense. That checks out. So the reason I was excited to have you on the show is because, well, I know that there's a number of people listening that have a component within their service offering that involves workshops, training, organizational change management. But then there's also the reality that the vast majority of people listening are often going into their clients with a strategy, or they're going in and trying to install a new brand or a new website or a new marketing system, and they need to affect organizational change. They need to educate a bunch of stakeholders in their clients' organizations on how to think differently, how to take a different approach, and how to change their behaviors going forward. And it's one of these things that whether you're intentional about it or not, it usually comes with the territory, and it's really, really hard. And you are an expert at this exact problem. So I'm really excited to dive into this, both directly related to the educational based stuff that you typically focused on, but also at this kind of layer of abstraction and how to think more in more of a nuanced way about setting yourself up for success and then also proving that success. So with that in mind, let's start with kind of defining, what is this impact in organizational change, and why is this such an important idea for people in this line of work?
So I think it's interesting when we're trying to drive lasting change inside a client's organization and be able to actually prove the impact of that change. Some people have it easier than others, right? Like I know this doesn't apply to most people on this call, but you can imagine this. If you're doing sales training, right, and you want to go in and change behaviors for clients around sales, the results are pretty immediate and pretty obvious. Right? It's either call bookings went up or close rate went up or whatever. There's a very direct and linear sort of correlation between the work that's being done, the intervention, and the results of that. But for most of us that are in marketing or leadership or culture change or any of these more sort of nuanced and abstract areas, the impact of the work that we're trying to do may not be realized for 6, 12, 18 months. And the challenge then is that we have this data black hole between the intervention that takes place and when the results actually show up. And anybody who wants to can shoot holes in that and say, yeah, I know we've got a pop over here, but lots happened since that intervention. So I don't think it was those guys that we worked with, 8 months ago. And so for me, the focus has been, well, how do we it's not that there's a black hole from a data collection and visibility standpoint, but stuff is happening, right, between intervention and measurable KPI outcome. So what is that stuff, and can we measure it? And so that's really, for me, it's around behavior change. The human beings are shifting behaviors that at some point will manifest in improvement, hopefully, on the KPIs. So let's take a look at that piece.
I think that this is especially true. Like if I think about a relevant example to the people listening is like brand strategy, for example, or doing a rebrand on a business. It's like that, especially in that long period where it's happening, the brand transition's taking place, like there is so much opportunity for ambiguity and for subjectivity in terms of how that's being evaluated. And even just like, is this brand good or bad is like such an inherently subjective thing. And that's true about a lot of the work that, creative agencies, digital agencies do, but in particular, when it comes to creative aspects of that work. So I think this is like really an important thing to talk about is when we're dealing with that level of ambiguity, what can we do to set ourselves up for more success and for a more objective proof that what we're doing is positive and is having an impact?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that ambiguity piece, because the ambiguity, yes, it invites subjectivity and other people's opinions, which muddies the waters, but it also has an inherent lack of urgency attached to it in most cases, right? It's either a project that's being set for the quarter or the year or whatever, or it's an executive's pet project, but it's not, we need to move this metric, therefore we need to do this project. It's a thing that sort of sits around that, right? And as we know, change for most of us is hard, largely due to the fact that our plates are full, right? We're not looking for, well, what can I do with this 4 hours a week, right? Well, I'll put it into advancing our brand strategy change. We're dealing with time pressures, we're dealing with a lack of urgency, we're dealing with external opinions, and a general sense of haziness around how we know if this thing is on or off track, right?
I think this is evidenced a lot of the time by one of the challenges that we see a lot of people face in this industry, which is this age-old story of we did all this work, we created this amazing brand or this amazing strategy for the client, we handed it to them, we got paid, and then nothing ever happened. And the brand never changed and the strategy never changed. And we sat back and we watched the client. We waited in anticipation for this to show up in the world, and it didn't. And it's a really dejecting feeling, I'm sure, for both client and agency, right? When you get all the way up to the point of delivering the outcome that you were hired for, but you don't get the impact, which is like the whole thing that you're focused on, is making sure that all this work that we do actually has an impact, which is ultimately the goal of this whole engagement.
Yeah, for all the reasons, right? Like we care about the work, we want it to, live in the world, and we want to strengthen that relationship with the client, and we want to have great case studies to share with the broader world. And if the work's not actually coming to fruition, then all those things become sort of naught as well, right?
So what are some of the key reasons that happens, that we do the work, we do the things, we deliver on the SOW, but the impact doesn't occur? What gets in the way of that?
Yeah. So I boil this almost entirely down to the humans in the process, right? So does the client organization, have a clear implementation path to get this out into market? And do the humans involved have really three things? We need three things as human beings to change. We need to know how to change. So we need to understand what the next steps are, which is where the process comes into play. But that's not enough. We also need a strong enough reason to want to change. Now, maybe in an employee environment, I don't want to get fired, that would be a strong enough reason. But if we're dealing with, SaaS company clients, and maybe it's a more sort of scrappy startup team that's our client, they may not have that, that got to do it to keep my job sort of thing. So there needs to be a strong enough reason to want to change. And then there needs to be a clear path within the realities that exist around what I'm going to do on a daily basis to move that forward. So I know that sounds a little bit like point one, but there's a difference between knowing how to change at an intellectual level and having a clear next step on the path to actually realizing that change. But those are the three areas that we need to dig into, I think.
Okay. So you've got process at a high level, you have motivation, and then it sounds like you have kind of the daily action or the tactical execution that comes with that. So let's talk about that. How do we set ourselves up for success and make sure that when we get to that critical moment with the client, that those three things are in place and are sufficiently in place to which to the degree that we have a good chance of having the impact?
Okay, cool. So let's, your audience and the space obviously much better than I do. So let's say it's a strategy project. So the agency is working with the client, they've crafted the strategy, now they're going in to share this strategy. Tell me what happens next. What's the normal process there?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's imagine it. Usually, I don't know why agencies love this so much, but we're addicted to presentation. We love having these big climaxes essentially in the client relationship where it's like ride or die. You
Yeah.
go in, you do the presentation, they either hate it or they love it. I don't know why we do that. We set ourselves up for these like
Mad
really
Men,
intense
because we
moments.
saw it on Mad Men. That's why.
Yeah, that's yeah. So anyway, I digress. So probably what's happening here is we've gone through all the work of developing a strategy, and then there's a presentation, and in that presentation, there's a whole bunch of really important stakeholders. We're presenting it, and then kind of waiting to see what they think,
Yep.
and then assuming that they love it, then we get into this conversation about, okay, well, what happens next? And in some cases, that's already been written into the SOW, but in a lot of cases, it's probably not. And then that kind of opens up this whole other conversation about like, okay, what are the next steps we're going to take together, if any, to get this implemented?
Well, and then I find, I don't know if your group finds this as well, but then there's often the misguided belief from the client that, well, we don't need help with implementation. We know how to communicate stuff through our organization. We'll take it from here.
Yeah,
Right. It's that happen. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a couple pieces within this for me. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the big flashy presentation. This, whether it's an agency to the client or whether it's a CEO and a town hall to the organization, there's nothing wrong with getting people excited and inspired by what we're working towards, right? So I don't want to take anything away from that. And your PowerPoints are safe or whatever people use nowadays. And that's just the start. That's really maybe the beginnings of the why. If we think about the how, why, and the path, right? On actually putting this stuff into practice. Basically, as an agency, we're telling them now why they should care about this strategy. And for some people, that's going to land. For most humans, being told why something matters doesn't actually work nearly so well as having the time to turn it over and find for ourselves why this thing matters, right? So piece number one, what I would suggest and what we see, again, we don't do a lot of agency work, but we do a ton of strategic plan implementations and culture change initiatives, which have a similar sort of feel to this. Between the presentation and the implementation plan, creating the space for the stakeholder group to actually turn over the so what for themselves, like themselves, Dave and Sally, not themselves, the entity, but to actually say, why do I, Dave, care about this? I don't know why, Dave, but why do I care about this? How would this make my life better if this brand was out there in the world? To really give time and space for people to find the so what behind getting on board with this is a major driver for getting people leaning in to the hard work that it's going to take to actually shift whatever needs to be shifted post session. So I would suggest that as point number one, create the space for people to find their own so what.
In terms like getting really tactical here, what do you find is like the right medium, or what mediums have you found are really effective to this? Is this typically a workshop that you're trying to, add to the scope of work and facilitate with your clients, or is there another way that you try to accomplish that outcome?
Yeah, I mean, the most consistent and reliable is conversation, ideally groups of 12 or less. And it's going to be, call it an hour. I don't know how long the presentation takes, but you want to sort of allow double or triple that for actual discussion. And in that discussion, it's not new content. It's not all the extra reasons why we think this is great. And it's hard when you've done the pitch and you've sort of like skinnied it all down into that soundbite. And then you're in conversation, you want to share more. Resist that urge. It's asking questions. Where are we at currently? And what does it look like when we're in that new place? How does life change for us? How does this impact us, like this nuclear team, as opposed to us, the broader organization? How will this impact our clients, positive, negative? Like being able to actually just sort of work through those questions and creating the space for them to come to their own conclusions. I find it's fascinating. It's a nerve-wracking exercise to get into because what if they hate it? Well, here's the thing. First of all, I can tell you statistically that about 95% plus do not hate it and they get on board with it and they're actually really excited about it. It's about 96%. So that's the good news. The other good news is that if they really don't like it, guess what? They didn't like it anyway. And so they weren't going to do anything with it. And now we know in an hour instead of waiting for 9 months, hoping that it's going to actually happen, right? And it gives us an opportunity to adjust. It's extremely rare that that happens. Most of the time, they're going to go from lukewarm to much warmer on the what this looks like when it's actually embedded. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to drive basically engagement, right, on what happens next.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. All right, so this is about post strategy, creating the space to, the primary job that I think we're speaking to here is allow everyone to get invested in the why and connect the dots between their motivations, why it's important for them, and the broader strategy that's been presented. But I'm also seeing that there's probably a lot of lines that start to get drawn as well to the how and to the path. In that conversation, I think organically a lot of this stuff is going to come up. So let's speak to those other two components. You mentioned how, why, and path. So we've talked a little bit about the why. What about the how and the path? How do we make sure that we get those things properly established?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up because you're right. When you start hearing the group asking the questions about the how and the path, they are leaning in, right? Like they're thinking forward to what comes next, which is a really positive sign. So the how is often going to come from the agency's special sauce. It's the agency saying, this is our recommendation or approach on how you're actually going to roll this out. Here's the stuff that we know based on the work we've done. It strengthens the agency's brand with the client. The path, conversely, is deeply personal because it's around what am I doing as the next step. I think sometimes the challenge is we're trying to drink an ocean through a straw, to borrow from somebody, where it's around, right, we saw this great deck. We've got the big lofty vision. That's a lot of work. So where do I actually start? How do I chunk this thing down? It's the tactics, of course, happen. Like, and again, I say happen. Someone needs to be responsible for actually planning the implementation of this. There's a second component here that I'm talking about, which is not about the process steps, but rather around the behavioral change that I'm going to engage in as I go through this. So what I mean by that is I've been a big proponent of communicating with clients in a certain way. This is going to be a little bit vague, but I've been a big proponent of communicating with clients in a certain way. Based on this strategy, I'm going to rethink how I communicate with clients because we're bringing a different tone or a different whatever to bear on this. And so there's some tactical stuff around the implementation, but there's also my daily reminder of the fact that I need to show up a little bit differently in my interactions in order to sort of grease the wheels on this change actually happening. The challenge with implementation, in my experience, is not typically a lack of process. It's all the space between the process steps, right? Around how do we show up differently as a group in order to move this forward?
That nuance is so important because like the difference between having a task, like my personal experience, I have a task in my Asana, but the degree to which I'm going to procrastinate on actually getting that task done comes down to the level of clarity I have on what it actually is and how I'm going to accomplish it, right? So it's one thing to say step 5 in the process is write this, implementation document for the marketing department. But there's a difference between that and what should be included in this document. How long should it be? Do I have an example of that? Have I done this before? And that every little incremental degree of ambiguity creates exponential amounts of resistance to someone actually taking action on that thing.
Well, so you just finished publishing a book. This is, to me, it's the comparison of writing a book versus writing every day, right? It's like you don't just write a book, and anyone who's written a book or thinks about it for 5 minutes realizes that's the case. You don't write a book. You write a couple paragraphs every day for a period of time until you have a book as the end result. And I think too often the things that we set that we believe are tasks are actually not tasks. They're outcomes of micro tasks that lead up to that. And so part of it, if you think about writing the implementation SOP or what have you, it's maybe it just turns into a daily writing practice, right? Maybe it turns into client calls like I will reach out to 3 clients a day sort of thing to feed into the end result that we need to create. But if we can chunk it down from outcome that's masking as a task into the daily practice that achieves that outcome, then we start to remove some of that friction.
Mm. So again, getting to kind of a tactical level, what do you find the right medium or process to get to that level of specificity looks like when you're facilitating this with, let's say a group of stakeholders within an organization?
Yeah. So there's a couple of tactical tips that folks can take from this. So number one is so I use a mantra of laughably small. It's easier just to do it than it is to justify not doing it. That's that's sort of at its most atomic level, right? What's the thing that is just like, well, that's ridiculous. I can't believe I even just wrote that down because that looks so stupid by comparison to all the big tasks I've got. I was talking to someone who ran the Boston Marathon in sub 3 hours, and she was talking about how in lead up to that, her daily practice would start with, when I wake up in the morning, instead of brushing my teeth, I will put on my left shoe. Like, okay, Boston Marathon, sub 3 hours. The actual thing that she was focused on was putting on my shoe first thing in the morning, basically, right? And so step number one is you don't have to share with anybody if you feel silly about it, although there is power in sharing it. But if you can take whatever the thing is on your list and say, what's the absolute smallest first step that I could do in a minute, right? Or less, do I have that clarified? And if I do, then I can start right down that path. So that would be, there's my number one tip. I got more, but thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I mean, what I'm drawing from that is, can you clearly define just the first step, the thing that gets you started doing that thing, and front loading that? I think even in just trying to describe something that's maybe a larger task or outcome or step in the process in terms of next actions, that's a big idea, right? So what's the first step?
Yep. Yeah. And I think along those lines, Dan Sullivan, strategic coach, has this one-page planning document that I use all the time, and he talks about how we take this big lofty thing and we break it down into its natural milestones. That's great, and then maybe we break that down into projects. We can break it down further and further and further. So along the same lines, but can you take that thing and break it into 6 chunks, right? And 6 is sort of an arbitrary number, but what would it look like? Whatever the level of sort of refinement that you've got, take it a whole degree further by another 6. And within one of those 6, can you look at what 3 of those laughable small steps look like? So I think, again, a big piece of it is that we're stuck in the inertia of having something on our to-do list that involves too many different things at once. And so we just put it off instead of actually moving forward. If we knew exactly what to do, and if we have, this comes back to the how, if we know how to do it and we have a strong enough reason to want to do it, and it's clear what the next step is, then we will do it. So if there's something holding us back, one of those 3 things is missing. Either we don't know how to do it, sort of from a competency standpoint, we don't care enough to want to do it, or we're not clear on what that next step is.
That in of itself is just a really helpful framework, I think, to when you do run into situations where things are stalled out, it's a home base to come back to and say, okay, across these 3 vectors, what do I think might be off? Where do I need to double click? So this has been very helpful. We've talked about the how, the why, the path. I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about impact, and in particular, proving impact, because it is possible, and I'm sure many people have had this experience of all of these things happening, and then still you have this conversation of, some person on the team that goes, yeah, we got this outcome, we got this transformation, but I don't know how much of that was these consultants that we hired or this agency that we hired, or just us being amazing and awesome because we're amazing and awesome. So let's talk about that. How do you make sure that you have a way of proving impact? What are some of the first principles that we should be thinking about to set ourselves up for success there?
So the big piece for me on this is around looking at what data is already being captured and what's not. And I know that sounds incredibly obvious, but there's going to be hopefully some sort of KPI internally measured. Like there's a business case for doing this thing in the first place. Otherwise, the question is, why are we doing this? So there's some business case. That business case is often disconnected from metrics. Piece one for me is saying, great, so we're doing this project. How will we know if it worked? Again, half your audience is probably doing that already. The other half's going, I should do that more often. I know that. But to ask that question of how will we know if this worked? That's going to point us towards lagging indicators or the fact that they have no idea. And before we get into actually trying to measure anything, we need to have alignment on what measurement even means. What does success even mean on this project? So we got to get clear on where we're going. And ideally, it's a metric that the client is measuring internally, right? There's something. The impact on that metric could be 6, 12, 18 months, but it gives us an anchor point in the future. Then we've got the activity that's happening on the front end, and we can show all the Asana boards and other stuff around. Here's all the stuff that's being done, right? With the gap in between, it's often not nearly as complicated as folks make it out to be, but it's to work through, ideally with a champion inside the client organization, to step by step say what is happening along the way, not the tasks anymore so much as the milestones that might be invisible, right? Like, are there things where, well, we've communicated this with our entire organization? It's like, okay, great. How will you know if you've communicated it with the entire organization? I don't know. Okay, great. We'll put a question mark on that, but that's a data point as a bit of a leading indicator. Because if we can map out here's all the things that need to happen in order to get to that lagging indicator metric of the KPI on their dashboard, it becomes a bit of a connect the dots exercise. It's never going to be bulletproof that there's a one-to-one causality on this. There's always going to be other stuff impacting. But so step one, identify where we're going. That's the endpoint KPI. Step two, identify the milestones along the way that may or may not be measured currently. With the dots that aren't measured currently, you can start to get creative around how might we measure those dots. So this was the origin of Actionable as a company. It became very clear that if a training or a learning program takes place and we expect it to impact KPIs, the step before KPI metrics is observable change. And the step before observable change is self-reported change. And you can stitch those pieces together. Self-reported change didn't really exist. And so we created Actionable as a vehicle to shine a light on that. I'm not suggesting you need to build a whole company around it, but if you can identify what those dots are and then have a creative conversation with your client around how would we measure that or what's a proxy for measuring that, then you start to connect the dots moving forward.
Okay, this is really interesting. So you mentioned there's the KPIs. One step back from that is the observable change. And then one step back from that is the self-reported change. So I'd love to just very quickly kind of double click on each of those so that we can understand conceptually what those look like. Because I'm sure that there are a lot of opportunities for the people listening to think about, okay, how might I be able to install more of that, especially into the early parts of the client relationship, so we can design more of that into the journey and have more feedback loops built into this whole process that help somebody have the confidence that, hey, this is actually doing what we intended it to do. We're making progress towards where we want to go.
Cool. So KPIs, and we could spend a whole 45 minutes on this, but I'll keep it lean and you point me where you want to go. So KPIs, they're going to have some sort of business metric, hopefully, that inspired the project in the first place. We can go deeper on that or not. Now, often there are, even within KPIs, which are by definition sort of lagging indicators, there's still leading and lagging within that. So, in my world, there might be a leadership development program because we're trying to improve employee retention. That's the lag. But there's metrics before that they're already measuring, things like absenteeism or performance or performance reviews, scores, like all the stuff that's still measured by the client, and it happens before people leave. So that becomes our sort of lagging indicator set. Observable change is exactly what it sounds like. It's 360s or 180s. It's basically people around the person responsible for doing something saying, are they actually shifting in any way? Are they doing the stuff they're supposed to do? There's lots of different tools out there for doing 360s or peer assessment stuff. What I found interesting was that, sort of like the proverbial rocket ship, most of the fuel is burned at the beginning in changing behaviors, right? We're either breaking inertia or we're breaking pre-existing patterns of behavior. And that the change, which is largely internal, where most of the energy is going into shifting my mindset or my behaviors or my interactions or my, these sorts of things, my daily practices. It's stuff that is, in many cases, is not yet observable because it's stuff going on between my ears, right? And yet it's where all the effort is at the beginning. And so I really wanted to shine a light on that. And so we use a really simple daily nudge mechanism where people that have said, and this was going back to the first point, I care enough about this project that I want to move it forward. We acknowledge that change is hard. So let's support those people as they engage in that change process. We'll give you a tool that reminds you on a daily basis of the thing that mattered to you. They go, yeah, that's great. And about 78% of people sign up for that. And so when they sign up for that, then they start getting a nudge from the actionable platform. And it says, hey, Marcel, you said that, when you're showing up with clients, you want to lead more with questions than with opinions. How's it going today? And completely self-assessed, right? Which makes some data purists go, well, that's not useful then. But I would argue it is in a second. Marcel rates himself on a 1 to 10 and then can journal about what's happening. That's it. It's a couple seconds. Marcel maybe does that 2 or 3 times a week. It's giving us visibility into how people feel around actually moving that thing forward, which allows us to have that faster feedback loop, that intervention before it's even seen by Marcel's teammates or clients, because it takes a while for Marcel to get comfortable with this and then for his clients to actually get out of their own heads and notice that something's different around here, right?
I gotta say, this is a big idea for me of saying, like, are there ways that, because you're right, we often focus just on the KPIs, and those are often lagging indicators. We might not have complete control and or visibility into those things, and it can be challenging. It puts us in a position where we really don't have a whole lot that we can tether ourselves to in terms of understanding if we're having an impact, being able to prove that impact, but also importantly, knowing earlier and more often if we're on track. And so this idea of having feedback mechanisms built into the client's organization to measure observable change. So asking stakeholders, are you noticing the impact on the thing? It could be on behavior change, but it could be on the brand, on how clients are perceiving the brand, on how leads are showing up to sales calls and what they're asking about and how they're viewing your position and the competitors that they're like, all of these kinds of things that could be observable change. And then also surveying the people that are involved in the process to understand how they're feeling about this. That is a big idea, and I think is a powerful thing to think about implementing in the scope of an engagement, especially where there is either a strategy component to it or there's an ongoing relationship, that there's a lot of upfront work before you see the impact, which is often true about marketing, about brand transformations, about website design development. You often having to go through this period of there's a lot happening, but there's not a lot of impact. And so you need signals along the way. So this is a big takeaway for me personally, just from this conversation.
That's awesome. I think, if I could just build off that for half a second, the Asana board is sticking in my head. It's the distinction for me between the activity and small I impact on a micro level. Even if you think about, your clients who are communicating this new brand strategy through the organization, the Asana board task is, we communicate it with the organization? It's like, yes, we sent the email or we did the town hall, right? Move to complete. It's like, right, but how many people heard it? And what do they take from it? And how are they feeling about it immediately, right? Some of that sentiment analysis stuff. Because nothing else matters. If the CEO did it, but no one could understand it or didn't get it, you could actually have more resistance than engagement on it. It's the kind of thing you want to know early on in the process, right? And I think for the agency that is bringing these type of considerations to their client, occasionally you'll get a client who feels like you're overstepping and they want to do it all on their own. Fine. But most of them want the project to be a success. And so when you suggest to them ways that they can ensure that they are getting faster feedback loops, you're providing value, but you're also elevating your brand status with them. You're no longer the web designers, you're the change, sort of enablers through that process.
It's funny because I think about, I just had a conversation today with a person on my team about this very thing of, there's something that wasn't going as well as I would like for it to go. And the conversation I had was like, I don't like that I'm the one who has to bring this up. And the reason I'm having to bring it up is because you don't have a feedback loop in place. So you're not aware that this is a problem. And I'm not as concerned about the problem as I am the mechanism by which the problem is getting discovered and resolved, and the fact that I have to look over your shoulder, which doesn't feel good for either of us, right? And I'm thinking about my experience working with somebody on my team and the fact that there's no feedback loop and it's creating this issue. And then I'm now applying that to a client relationship where it's like, as a client, having to go to your agency and saying, hey, this isn't working, I'm getting negative feedback, there's a problem here that you guys aren't aware of, and constantly feeling you have to bring these things to the agency, versus imagine the feeling where an agency comes to you proactively and says, hey, we've noticed that there's this thing that is a challenge. We've noticed there's a part of this that's not going the way that we thought it was going to. Here's what we've observed, and here's what we think we should adjust in order to give you a good chance of success. Like, it totally shifts the dynamic. And that's like the dream as a stakeholder in this, to have that person taking that level of ownership.
Yeah. And look, what I've found is that the reason, whether it's stated or not stated, why some folks shy away from this is because, like, well, I don't want to see the bad news. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. Maybe if I just pretend it's not there, it'll go away. Again, not consciously, but I think there's a subconscious fear. What I can say with absolute certainty is that there will be bad news and there will be great news. And either way, you bringing it to your client elevates your status. What I find super cool about this, exactly as you said, Marcel, here's the challenge areas that exist, and here's our recommendations for what to do about it. As equally, here's the bright spots, and here's the specifics of what we're seeing in that, and what I think we should double down on. And here's the net new information. We call it the triple double. It's the double down, double back, double click. You've got the stuff that's going great. You've got the stuff that we need to circle back on, and you get the new information that continues to elevate that relationship as well.
Well, Chris, we could talk about this for a very long time. You and I can talk about anything for a very long time, but we don't have a very long time because we both have companies to run. So with all of that, for the people that want to learn more about what you're doing at Actionable, consume more of the great content that you publish, where should we send them in the show notes?
Probably we'll link actionable.co is the domain. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active there. So you can find me, Chris Taylor, on LinkedIn.
Amazing. So show notes, we will have links to Chris's LinkedIn, to actionable.co, and a few other things. With that, Chris, thank you so much for making the time to come on the show today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, my friend. Great to see you.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.